So to start with, Professor, how do you think we as a StriveUK can support you? How do you think we?
That's a very important question. Like I just suggested here, it's usually Palestine is a global struggle against racism, against discrimination. It's a fight for truth, for justice, for basic human rights. I met somebody in Malaysia when I was doing my PhD, and he said, "What do you want as Palestinians?" And when I said what we wanted, he was like, "Oh my God, these are basic human rights." It makes me sad that I thought it's complicated. I said it's not complicated. So we asked people around the world to talk about Palestine, to be part of the struggle. And we always insist that you don't have to be an Arab, a Palestinian, an Arab, a Muslim, or Middle Eastern, or Asian to stand for truth. All you have to be is a human being with a heart, with a conscience. So what we expect people to do is to read what Palestinians, to listen to Palestinians, to amplify Palestinian voices. And I insist that this Palestine is not unique. And I'm Palestinian, I'm saying this. There are also other struggles around the world that we are part of, because discrimination, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. So we are part of this global struggle. And to support Palestine, like I said, we need to be part of this. If we can listen to Palestinians, spread their voices, help them find more and more spaces here and there, that would be really, really great.
Thank you for that. Yes, we have been telling stories of Palestinians, and we have been having discussions about Palestine, and we have been participating in protests and all. Still, we feel we are very helpless, and still we feel that we are not that much of a help to you. But inshallah, you're always in our duas as well. There is another question from audience. What would you consider as the greatest source of hope for the youngsters in Gaza, especially having witnessed the siege for almost 14 years and everyone having personal losses?
We see hope. We have to see, we have no choice. Despair is a luxury that Palestinians do not despair, that do not afford. Despair is a luxury that we cannot afford. The hope we get springs from our commitment to truth, to justice, our love to our land. And wherever you go, you will see how Palestinians, and this is again in some of the stories here, if you read the story of the land, it tells about the man whose fields, whose groves, olive trees were uprooted by Israel. And every time Israel destroys and uproots them, he keeps planting them. This is the hope that we belong here. Unlike what the Israeli Jewish settlers do, they burn. Can you imagine that almost 1 million olive trees were destroyed, uprooted by Israel in the past 7 decades? People who claim to own this land do not destroy 1 million olive trees. But we Palestinians, we clutch to hope by planting, by looking in the eyes of our parents and grandparents, by listening to their stories, by looking into the eyes and hopes and wishes of our children. In one of the massacres, one of the most hideous massacres that even the New York Times covered last month, Israel killed 44 people in one air raid in Gaza City. And total families were eradicated. 22 family members from one family, and I think other 15 members, like 44 Palestinians from 3 families. And there was this man, Riyad Shkuntana, his wife was killed, 2 daughters were killed, 2 sons were killed, and only one little girl survived. And my hope is to see Mother free and to see her wishes come true, her dreams come true. This is what gives us hope. Also, what gives us hope is the support we see from Muslims and non-Muslims, from Arabs and non-Arabs around the world. We've seen how millions of people took to the streets, despite the restrictions, the lockdown, despite COVID-19. Millions of people went out to took to the streets because they believe in Palestine and the Palestinian cause. This also gives us hope.
And another question, are you considering writing or editing new stories? Is one question that have come.
Yeah, honestly, I am. I have at least 3 projects for possible books. Hopefully, when you are in Gaza, you don't have time to do anything. It's always crowded. You get always distracted all the time. We have 12 hours of electricity per day, so it's time consuming, not easy to do. When I worked on Gaza Writes Back, I was in Malaysia, so I had everything around me. So hopefully, I have a book about a book of poetry and a book of short stories, and also a book for children. And when I published my article by New York Times, my kid asks if Israel can bomb us in the dark. I was approached by somebody asking me to write a book, some kind of diaries of my experiences as a Palestinian. And I'm not sure which book is going to come first, but hopefully there will be something soon about Gaza from Gaza, from Palestine, a book like Gaza Writes Back.
Inshallah, looking forward to read. Now, next question we have is, what are the expectations of yourself and fellow Palestinians of the Palestinian government? Do you think they are doing enough?
This is a really embarrassing issue for us as Palestinians, but it's what happened to all oppressed people. There have always been natives whose destiny, whose privileges were connected with the existence of the occupation. What happened in Palestine in the early 90s was the first Palestinian Intifada, where everybody was, rising against the occupation. Israel couldn't handle all the Palestinians throwing stones and, resisting popular resistance. And the plan was, we can't handle these Palestinians, so let's bring some Palestinians to control these. And that's why the Palestinian Authority, like 2 days ago, the Palestinian Authority police in the West Bank killed a Palestinian activist. They wanted to arrest him because he was critical of Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. So for many people, the Palestinian Authority does not represent us. It doesn't represent our aspirations, our hopes, our goals. So like many people who lived under occupation, who suffered from the fact that some of their own people side with the occupiers, connect their future and connect their existence with the occupation, we are suffering from this, and it's really, really horrible. As a matter of fact, it's because we don't have the Palestinian Authority in Gaza that we have this amazing resistance.
Thank you. How do your students cope with all the violence, the suffering and the siege, their dreams, their worldviews? Could you shed light on what drives them?
I think some of you are students, some of my the people listening to me, and I want to insist that what's happening is horrible. One of my students, Zainab al-Qolaq, the massacre I just mentioned, lost 27 members of her family. Her mother, 2 brothers, 2 sisters, and other 15 extended family members in one strike. She's a student studying English literature. Her home was destroyed. She contacted us at the English department, and he said, we're ready to help you cope whatever you want. We can explain again to you. We can make you do incomplete exams at your convenience, etc. And this, like, part of this question, like the hope, she didn't give us on hope, on living, on continuing life. 3 weeks after the strikes, the massacres, she came back asking what she wanted to do to finish her exams and assignments and everything. And we were totally understanding and totally flexible with her. Another student of mine has her home destroyed. Her husband was seriously injured. She lost all her books, all her notes. We try to be flexible. We provide them with all the services they want. But how do you live? How do you come out of this war when you are personally hurt, when you lose family members? But we understand as Palestinians, we can't give up. Israel wants to push us to despair. Israel wants us to, like I said, to stop telling stories, to stop living, to stop studying, to stop going to university, to stop going to work. And that's why, as Palestinians, we see every aspect of our lives, every aspect, as resistance. Even going to school, even, the mundane, horrible, boring task of doing your homework, we see this as resistance. Reading your book is an act of resistance. Living is an act of resistance. We can't simply just give up to Israel. So the students suffer, and I personally try to urge them to write, to go to social media. If you are on Twitter, many of my students are there on tweeting about their lives, the mundane. But again, in Palestine, personal is political because everything is touched, impacted by Israel. We try to connect to the people, to reach out to the people, to express ourselves, to release this tension in any form, in creative forms. In my Shakespeare class, for example, I asked my students to do anything. I said, okay, there were 10 marks for an assignment to do a recitation or a performance of Shakespeare. And what I had in mind is to help them release some of the anger. The way they choose what extract, what soliloquy, what dialogue in Shakespeare, the way they recite it, the way they perform it, is therapeutic in a sense. And more importantly, I asked them to write. Many of my students wrote articles that were published. So this is how they cope. They cope by insisting on living. They cope by continuing being, doing what they do as Palestinians.
My question, first of all, I want to say that your book is one of my favorite and the best book I have read. And my question is, all of the writers are really young. How were they able to express the story and what happened? Because in one of the chapters, I think it's called Spared, the boy says what happens to his friends after they were bombed. And yeah, how were they able to express this and tell us about their stories?
It's not easy. It's like one of, like you mentioned, one of my favorite stories, Spared by Rawani Ari. Rawani Ari was 18 or 17 when she wrote this story, and she wrote it in English. We did some editing to the stories, but I would say minimal editing, marginal editing in a sense. So many people say, "Oh my God, these like native speakers," because I said because we have amazing people in Gaza, amazing talents, writers, poets. You will be amazed in my poetry classes, every class, and we talk about non-native speakers. My students write about 100 poems in English. So they have this talent. And you referred to this poem that is heartbreaking. When people ask me to name 3 stories that they want to start with, I say, read Ill for Life by Hanan Habashi, Canary by Nouri Susi, and Spared by Rawani Ari. And in this story, it's a simple story. A little kid who wants to go out to play football, and his mother keeps him inside because she's preparing lunch. And he's on the balcony watching and cheering his kids scoring all the goals, and he's being grumpy. Mom, hurry up, I want to go out and play. And at that moment, Israel strikes nearby where the little kids play and kills and maims most of the little kids. And this little kid survives. He's injured, but he survives. And in the stories, and please let me read like one paragraph. So after the massacre, when everybody is killed or injured, the main speaker, the first person narrator in the story, Ahmad was gone, says Ahmad was gone. The others haunted me with their blaming looks every day I went to school. I couldn't look at them. Amputated limbs, scarred faces, limping gaits. Our neighboring was blown to smithereens in a split second. No more games were played, no more goals, no more cheering. And my friends grew up in 1 second. They no longer looked at me the same way they used to before that awful day. They wouldn't come out to play, and they had a distant look, like Uncle Abu Ahmed when he looked at me, like I didn't understand, like they knew something I didn't know, like I did something wrong. And we're talking about an 18-year-old little girl, young girl, a teenager, writing this profound, because even the word spared, who was spared? The idea here, the suggestion is that the people who were killed, they are the people who were spared because they don't have to live with the pain and the trauma of surviving others. And that's why as an educator, as a teacher in Gaza, my first challenge is to convince the young people that they can write, to convince them that we have the story inside us. It's out there. All we need to do is do some poking, do some free writing, get it out. And this applies to everybody. But as Palestinians, like I said, we have very rich experiences. We have very, very rich experiences. So how can young people come up with this? Because we are Palestinians. We've been living in Gaza. We've been experiencing this.
Thank you. It's really inspirational how you encourage your students, the young generation, to come up with their stories and to let them out. MashaAllah. May you be able to do more and more of this. The next question is, why aren't the Arab regimes supporting the struggle? You did mention about the overwhelming support of the Arab people, but the lack of support of regimes.
The thing is that after when the British Empire collapsed, when the European empires collapsed, when Africa and Asia were colonized, mostly the physical colonization ended, the physical occupation ended, but the colonization of the mind, the colonization of the elite, of the higher upper class, of the politicians, still remains intact. Now, it's like what America does here in some countries. They rule by proxy. And that's why you remember the Arab Spring. When the Arab Spring, when it first started, it was a real struggle against dictators. But then Israel saw that as a threat, and Europe saw that as a threat, and America saw that as a threat, because it means that if Arabs rise against the dictators, it means they're going to be what's the word, to break the chains and to be free. And if you are free, you will be an amazing country where there is no or minimal corruption, where so what's going on basically is that the Arabs, most of the countries, if not all of them, in a way, to please, like what's going on, for example, in some countries that normalize with Israel. If they want, they understand that if they want to continue to rule, they need to be friends with America, to support Israel, to normalize with Israel. So we don't like, and I hear this many times, like some of the Zionist trolls on Twitter say, look, even the Arab countries don't support you. No, the people support us, support the struggle. Only the corrupt dictators do not support Palestine, because they know that America is going to punish them, that Israel is going to punish them, because they know if Palestine is free, it means their people are going to rise against their corruption and against their brutality and their atrocities. So we have no hope in the Arab regimes whatsoever. And this is sad, but it's the truth.
Yeah, it's really sad. Along with that, even Turkey, we can see that they're not in full support with Palestine. What do you have to say about that?
I think there are like some countries are better in a sense, or not as bad as Qatar and Turkey have been a lot better to Gaza, at least to Gaza, than many other countries. But in general, Palestinians, we appreciate all sorts of support. Whatever people do to support Palestine, we appreciate that. If you don't want to, it's up to you. The thing is that we understand that as Palestinians, the struggle for freedom is going to go on. And I hear this all the time from people around me. I told, I'm not sure where I said this, but in 2009, during Gaza Operation Castled, I remember a relative of mine, one of my cousins, he had a disability. But what he did then astonished everybody. He wanted to buy a gun and to resist and to fight back. And we were like, oh, you can't do it. He said, Israel is killing everybody. Whether you resist, whether you fight back, whether you are asleep at home, Israel is going to kill you. And if Israel is going to kill me, I better die fighting back, standing for what I believe for my country. So we know, like, many people say, oh, everybody is, abandoning Palestine. We want everybody to stand with Palestine. Like, we want everybody to stand against racism, against black people, with people to stand for people in Kashmir, in Myanmar, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, everywhere. We want justice and truth around the world. But if there is nobody standing with us, we will continue the struggle. And I always say this, Israel has been trying to eradicate and massacre and silence Palestinians for over 7 decades. And Israel has failed. Look at what's going on in Jerusalem. Israel is not, it continues to kill, to displace, to steal, but we are not silent. At least we object, at least we protest. And this is very important, because the message Palestinians send to peoples around the world that we just simply can't give up because the occupier is brutal. Israel is so brutal, unprecedented brutal when it comes, like in the past war on Gaza, the past campaign of atrocities, unprecedented brutality. Never heard of this or seen this. The amount, the fear, the terror that it brings on Palestinians, killing as many Palestinians as possible. But at the same time, Israel wants us to give up, to surrender, to raise the white flag. And we're not going to do that. That's not going to happen, even if only one Palestinian is alive. Because we know we fight for future. If people look back 100 years in the future and say, oh, the Palestinians gave up, they stopped the struggle, this is going to be a bad example for humanity. So we want to be a good example for humanity.
Inshallah. Jaza wants to ask you a question. Jaza, can you unmute yourself?
Oh, okay. So I read the book, your book. It was really amazing. I read one of the stories, which was the canary. I just wanted to say how, like, the girl, she loved the boy, and it was like, it really, like, she was saying how much she loved him. It was amazing how she said that. But as soon as she found out his origin, like, she quickly switched up. Like, she quickly decided that she wanted to kill him. That, like, it scares me how someone can be so kind to you, and then suddenly, just because of where you came from, they suddenly decide, oh, I don't like you anymore. And I have a question to ask you. It's very devastating that I have to ask you this, because I should never be able to ask someone this, but how did your kids cope hearing that their own home country was bombed and that like that. How did they cope with that?
Okay, thank you again for mentioning this particular theme in Gaza Writes Back. How how two people could possibly be the best couple, but simply one of them is a Zionist, one of them is a soldier that wants to kill you, and wants to kill you just because you are a Palestinian. That's why everything changes. Going back to my kids, and this applies to so many things. I'll send you a link to my article on I published on New York Times, in which I documented how my kids try to cope. We were watching Al Jazeera, and there was a live stream because Israel wanted to bomb a huge building, and the power went out. And my little kid Lena, 8 years old, she asked Nusayba, my wife, can Israel still bomb the building now it's dark? And this child this beautiful, devastating, but beautiful question coming from a little girl, 8 years old, shows how innocent, how cute they are, how they try to, to outlive this with the hope of hoping, that because it's dark, maybe Israel cannot destroy, cannot kill. And also during the war, it was my little daughter, Amal, my little daughter's birthday, and we couldn't have a cake, we couldn't have candles, and she knew that we can't have this because she understands, although she's 5 years old, she understands this, that there is something going on, there's something wrong going on, and she didn't ask for candles, she didn't ask for cake, although she's been preparing for this for months. During the war, we as parents, we were living atmosphere. Like literally, I would sometimes when the kids are asleep, I would hear my wife. My wife is the bravest woman I've ever seen in my life. Israel killed her brother, her grandfather, three of her uncles, her cousin, her sister, her sister's wife, and her sister's eldest child, and two daughters. And this just in 2014. She's very, very, and this applies to most Palestinian women. She's very courageous. But sometimes at night when the kids, I would hear her weeping because of the fear, because of our inability to provide safety and security for the little ones, for the kids, for the ones we love. We fear because my little daughter would be terrorized by just at the door slamming. I would be afraid to go to the kitchen for a glass of water because Israel would, be afraid to go to the loo because we are afraid Israel might bomb. So we try as parents, we try to give kids hope, playing with them, telling them stories like I just did. But the kids themselves are the most intelligent. Yes, they can be horrible and naughty and everything, but they are great in the way they try to cope. I tweeted about this many times. My kids were fascinated during the war and after using their cubes and their toys to build homes and buildings and houses. They usually play, bride and groom and, the little dolls. And this is basically what it is. But most of their playing turned into building homes, creating large buildings, high-rise buildings. In a way, I feel that this was a coping mechanism. It's like Israel is destroying and these little kids are building. But don't take this in a very poetic, romantic way. It's very hard. It's very tough on the kids. We like even my own kids sometimes wake at night afraid. I hear this from my friends. They always say this. And one thing I also like to emphasize is that Israel wants to terrorize the vulnerable the most. During the last 11 days of atrocities, Israel kept bombing 24/7, but it intensified the bombing at night, because this is the time the kids sleep. This is the time the sick sleep. This is the time the elderly sleep. And when you are about to sleep, Israel would be insanely bombing the areas, awakening the kids, terrorizing them. Israel wants to do this. And hopefully we try to because someone was saying that we don't have post-war trauma in Gaza because the trauma never ends. It's continuous. And this is why it's our job as Palestinians, as supporters of Palestine, to try to help the kids, the organizations that help the kids. We believe in the future. Unlike Bobby Sands, the amazing Irish legend says, our revenge is the laughter of our kids. When our kids laugh, this is our revenge. This is part of our struggle because Israel doesn't want this. The occupation doesn't want the laughter, doesn't want the future to go on, and we insist on going on.
One question here is, do you think there is a shift in public opinion favoring the Palestinian in the recent past? If so, what is bringing on this change?
Yeah, that's a very important question. I think it's social media. Social media is bringing this. And the understanding, people started to see what Israel is. Israel is a racist endeavor. People have started to see this. Even in the UK, people who have never supported Palestine have seen how the Israeli lobby, for example, is interfering in internal politics because they want to classify every valid, legitimate criticism of Israeli occupation as anti-Semitism. In America, they started to see how, for example, Netanyahu, the former Israeli prime minister and war criminal, how he was Trump's best friend. How this, barbarity, the inhumanity of Trump was supported by the Israeli leaders at that time. And social media, people started to listen more and more to Palestinians, following Palestinian voices, amplifying them. And this broke the barrier of fear. We've seen footballers, Manchester United, Manchester City, and Chelsea, Leicester. We started seeing models for the first time, with not necessarily the Hadids, who are original Palestinians, but others, and actors and celebrities and politicians. This is bringing the change. And the BDS movement, I hope you're following the BDS movement, follow the BDS movement, and how they speak about Palestine and spread awareness. This is not a Muslim versus Jews struggle. This is a struggle of Palestinians against a brutal occupation. I say this all the time. If the occupiers, if the people occupying us are Muslims, we are going to fight them as ferociously as we fight the Israeli occupation. It's not about what religion you are. It's about what you do, the brutality, the evil you bring into the native. So there is an amazing shift, and like millions took to the street despite COVID and lockdowns. And hopefully, in the future, we'll have more and more support, more and more mobilization. If this starts shifting into politicians, like what's happening in America with congressmen and senators speaking for Palestine, speaking against the occupation, and in the UK, we were hopeful that Jeremy Corbyn would be in power, would have been totally different. But we understand why he came under pressure, why he was demonized, why he was labeled as anti-Semite, because he's a human being, he's a decent human being. The change, it's gaining momentum. In 5 years, in 10 years, we'll have more politicians speaking for Palestine, and hopefully, under the pressure of the masses, the voters, like what happened, for example, to Andrew Yang in New York. Andrew Yang, amidst the brutal massacres in Gaza, he said, I support Israel. And there was an uproar. Everybody tweeted against him, contacted him when he was in his campaign in New York. Muslims and non-Muslims were making fun of him and abusing him for his brutality, for siding with Israel. And I think in part he lost because he supported Israel. People need to understand that, especially politicians, if they want to support Israeli genocide, Israeli massacre, Israeli occupation, they will pay and they will lose voices. They will lose support and votes.
One question. In your story, The Old Man and the Stone, you portray owning a piece of stone as the symbol of a Palestinian possessing Jerusalem and dying with it. How is such emotional attachment sustained by Palestinians?
This is something that is personal to me. Like I said, I have never been able to go to Jerusalem. I cannot go to Jerusalem because of Israel, and this applies to millions of Palestinians. I once asked a friend of mine to bring me a stone from Jerusalem, and he got me one. I cherished it, I loved it, I cared, like it's like a plant, like a living being. And then all came to me that maybe he didn't bring it from. What if he didn't bring it from Jerusalem? He just found it somewhere and told me this is something. And I started questioning the symbolism I put into this stone, and I wanted symbols and icons are important, but the real thing is the real thing. The real thing is being able to go to Jerusalem. It cannot be replaced. The real thing is that we don't need to be deceived by, although again, like I said, trees and stones and everything is very, very precious. Everything that connects us to Jerusalem and Palestine is precious. But the real thing is having Palestine back, restoring Jerusalem back, having our ability, our right to physically be there is what matters most.
So before we conclude, I would like to ask one more question. I'm sorry if I'm invited. So it was very interesting for us to know that your children are also experts in the storytellers, and we are truly inspired by them. Would you mind if we were able to meet them on camera now so that we can convey our salams and regards?
Okay, this is Amal.
Assalamu alaikum. Anyone? And this is Sarah. Sarah, she's 12. Sarah has memorized 13 juzu from the Holy Quran.
MashaAllah.
And she's really, she has a really cool voice. She loves reciting the Quran, and she reads all the books I buy here, and I can't keep up. I always, when I want to encourage her, I tell her I'll buy you books, Sarah. And this is little Amal.
Assalamu alaikum, Amal.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum, Amal.
But she has a very, very low voice. Yalla, bye. Hey, we have kids here. Assalamu alaikum. What's their names? It's political, but also personal and familial, because this is what brings us together. You don't have to be a Muslim, you don't have to be an Arab, you don't have to be Palestinian, and that's the beauty of Palestine. It brings all of us together.
Thank you everyone for tuning in today. It's honestly so nice to see so many people. But first, let's all take a moment to pray for the people of Gaza. They're suffering the wrath of the bombs and explosions, and they've lost so much, their loved ones, their homes, and the life they once had before. May Allah Ta'ala give them strength and will to face all of it head on and keep resisting. May Allah Ta'ala stop all this violence and finally give them peace. May Allah Ta'ala accept this dua. Ameen.
Ameen.
Ameen.